In the quiet corners of our world, there exist phenomena that defy explanation. Stories whispered in the shadows about minds capable of bending reality itself. Throughout history, governments have chased these possibilities, seeking to harness what most consider impossible. This is one such story. A story about a girl who became something more than human, not by choice, but by circumstance. A girl whose very existence would reshape the understanding of what the human mind can achieve. The beginning. Before there was 11. Our story begins not in the 1980s, but years earlier, in the tumultuous summer of 1969. The Vietnam War raged overseas, protests filled American streets, and in the halls of government buildings, secret programs operated beyond public scrutiny. One such program bore the designation MKUltra, a real initiative conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency. The stated goal was simple yet chilling: to develop techniques for mind control, to create weapons from human consciousness itself. At Indiana University in Bloomington, a young woman named Terry Ives made a decision that would echo through decades. Terry, as she was known, was raised by parents who taught her to question authority, to seek truth in a world of lies. After her parents died in a tragic accident, leaving her in the care of her older sister Becky, Terry became increasingly drawn to conspiracy theories and alternative ways of thinking. When researchers at nearby Hawkins National Laboratory posted advertisements seeking volunteers for psychological studies, promising compensation that could help with her mounting bills, Terry saw an opportunity. The experiment seemed harmless at first. Researchers led by a man named Dr. Martin Brenner assured participants they were simply testing the boundaries of human perception. Terry and other volunteers would be placed in sensory deprivation tanks, submerged in warm salt water in lightless, soundless chambers. While floating in this void of sensation, they were administered powerful psychedelic compounds, LSD, psilocybin, substances that altered the very fabric of consciousness. The researchers claimed they were studying expanded states of awareness. In truth, they were searching for something far more dangerous. What Terry didn't know, what none of the volunteers knew, was that Dr. Brenner had already found what he was looking for. Years before Terry ever entered that laboratory, Brenner had encountered a boy named Henry Creel, a child who possessed natural psychic abilities that defied all scientific understanding. Henry could move objects with his mind, could reach into the thoughts of others, could reshape reality through sheer force of will. When Henry's powers grew too dangerous and he attacked his own family, Brenner stepped in, not as a saviour, but as a collector of rare specimens. He took Henry to Hawkins Lab, studied every aspect of his abilities, and began asking himself a single question: could these powers be replicated? The answer came through gruesome experimentation. Brenner discovered that certain psychedelic compounds activated similar regions of the brain that lit up when Henry used his abilities. He theorized that exposing developing fetuses to these substances might fundamentally alter their neural architecture, might grant them capabilities that should not exist. Terry Ives became an unwitting participant in this grand experiment when she discovered, weeks into the program, that she was pregnant. The father was Andrew Rich, a fellow student who Terry had met at a war protest. They had connected over shared ideals, over dreams of changing the world for the better. But Andrew's student deferment was revoked after his arrest at a demonstration, and according to accounts from those who knew Terry, he was drafted and sent to Vietnam before he ever learned he was going to be a father. He would die overseas, never knowing the child Terry carried, never knowing what that child would become. As Terry's pregnancy progressed, the experiments continued. Brenner, now aware of her condition, saw not a problem but an opportunity. He carefully calibrated the doses, monitored her responses, watched with clinical fascination as the child developed inside a womb flooded with consciousness-altering chemicals. According to some accounts, Terry may have also received a transfusion of Henry Creel's blood during this period, though the exact details of all procedures remain unclear. What is certain is that something fundamental was happening to the developing fetus, something that would remain unexplained for years to come. On June 7th, 1971, Terry Ives gave birth to a daughter via caesarean section. She named her Jane. For just a moment, as she emerged from anaesthesia after an emergency caesarean section, Terry saw her child. She heard her cry. She watched as Dr. Brenner lowered his surgical mask, revealing an expression that was not one of medical concern, but of triumph. Then darkness claimed her again, and when she woke, Becky sat at her bedside with devastating news. The baby hadn't survived. A miscarriage, they said. A tragedy, but one that sometimes occurs. There was no body to bury, no death certificate to file. Just emptiness. But Terry knew. Deep in her bones, in some part of her consciousness that had been fundamentally altered by those months of experimentation, she knew her daughter lived. She could feel it, could sense it in ways that had no words to describe. When she tried to tell people, when she attempted to sue Brenner and the laboratory, no one believed her. Without documentation, without evidence, she was just another grieving mother, unable to accept her loss. What Terry didn't know, couldn't have known, was that her daughter Jane had been transported just a few miles away, back to Hawkins Laboratory. There, in sterile rooms, beneath tons of concrete and earth, Dr. Brenner began the next phase of his grand experiment. The infant was given a new designation, stripped of the name her mother had lovingly chosen. She became 11, the 11th subject in Brenner's program of test children. A number, not a name. A specimen, not a person. The laboratory years, forging a weapon. 11's earliest memories were not of warmth or love, but of cold white rooms and the smell of antiseptic. The laboratory became her entire world, the only reality she knew. Dr. Brenner insisted the children call him Papa, a cruel mockery of paternal affection designed to create dependency and loyalty. For 11, Papa was not a father figure to rebel against, but the very centre of existence itself. His approval meant safety. His disappointment meant isolation and punishment. The laboratory housed multiple children, each bearing a number, each possessing abilities that defied natural law. There was 8, a girl named Collie, who could create illusions, could make people see things that weren't there, or fail to see what stood before them. There was 2, older than 11, and seemingly more confident in his powers, who had become her early tormentor. There were others, children whose names and faces would fade from memory, but whose presence created a strange mockery of normal childhood. The children spent their days in a large room whose walls were painted with rainbows. It should have been cheerful, should have evoked joy and play. Instead, it felt like a prison decorated to seem less cruel. They had toys, but everything they did was observed, measured, catalogued. Every game was an opportunity for Brenner and his researchers to study how their minds worked, to push the boundaries of what these gifted children could achieve. For 11, the early experiments were exercises in frustration. Brenner would place simple objects before her: a soda can, a toy, a small weight. The instruction was always the same: move it with your mind. Don't touch it. Don't use your hands. Just focus your thoughts and make it respond to your will. The other children could often accomplish these tasks with relative ease, but 11 struggled. 2 and the others mocked her, called her weak, told her she would never measure up to their abilities. The physical toll of attempting to use her powers was immediately apparent. Even small successes came at a cost. When she finally managed to crush a soda can through sheer mental force, blood immediately began streaming from her nose. The researchers noted this with interest but no concern. They understood that her powers drew from some deep well within her, that channeling them required immense physical and mental strain. But they saw this cost as acceptable, even desirable. A weapon that never depletes is certainly powerful, but a weapon whose limits can be measured and managed is more controllable. Brenner pushed harder. He introduced living subjects into the experiments, presenting 11 with a cat and instructing her to use her abilities on the animal. The request was vague, deliberately so. Would she harm it? Could she? 11, who had been denied affection and gentleness her entire life, found herself unable to cause suffering to the creature. She refused. She simply sat there, staring at the cat, unwilling to demonstrate her power in this way. The punishment was immediate and severe. 2 guards grabbed her, began dragging her toward the isolation room. This was the laboratory's most effective tool for controlling the children. Solitary confinement in a small dark space. For 11, who craved any form of human contact, even if it came from her captors, this isolation was torture beyond words. The fear it instilled was primal, overwhelming. But in that moment, something changed. As the guards pulled her toward that door, rage flooded through her. Not the petulant anger of a child denied a treat, but a deep, existential fury at the injustice of her existence. Her power, dormant or struggling until this point, exploded outward. One guard was flung against the wall with such force that his body left a crater in the concrete. The other's neck snapped before he could even cry out. The door to the isolation room never closed. Brenner, witnessing this display from behind protective glass, did not react with horror at the deaths. Instead he smiled. This was what he had been waiting for, what he had been pushing her toward. 11 could harness enormous power when sufficiently motivated by extreme emotion. He gently carried the sobbing, traumatized child away from the bodies of the men she'd killed, whispering words of comfort and praise. He had found the key to unlocking her potential, and he would use it without mercy. The experiments evolved. Brenner introduced a tool that would become crucial to 11's development, the sensory deprivation tank. This was a sealed chamber filled with salt-saturated water heated to skin temperature, designed to eliminate all external stimuli. When lowered into this tank, sealed away from sight and sound and sensation, 11 found that her mind could expand beyond her body's physical confines. In the void of the deprivation tank, 11 discovered she could project her consciousness into a mental space that she came to think of simply as the darkness. In this space, which she would later call the void, she could search for people, could observe them from impossible distances, could listen to their conversations and watch their actions. It was remote viewing taken to an extraordinary extreme, a form of psychic espionage that the Cold War intelligence community had dreamed about for decades. Brenner tested this ability extensively. He would show 11 photographs of Soviet agents, would task her with locating them in the void and reporting on their activities. She became startlingly proficient at this. Lying in the sensory deprivation tank, electrodes monitoring her brain activity, she would drift into that dark mental space and search until she found her target. Then she would relay what she saw and heard, providing intelligence that would have been impossible to gather through conventional means. But the void held dangers that Brenner hadn't anticipated. During one such session, while searching for a Russian operative, 11's consciousness brushed against something else. Something that didn't belong in the same reality as the person she was observing. It was a creature. Something with no face but filled with teeth. Something that radiated hunger and predatory awareness. The moment she sensed it, terror overwhelmed her. She thrashed in the tank, desperate to return to her body, to escape that mental space where impossible things lurked. Brenner aborted the experiment, but his scientific curiosity was aroused. What had she encountered? Where did it exist? Despite Eleven's obvious trauma, despite her fear, he ordered her back into the tank with new instructions. Find the creature again and make contact. On November 6th, 1983, 11 did as she was commanded. In the void she found the creature again. It stood hunched over something that looked organic, almost like an egg, feeding in whatever manner such beings feed. Against every instinct screaming at her to flee, she reached out and touched it. The moment contact was made, reality itself seemed to tear. A rift opened between dimensions, a gateway connecting the laboratory to wherever that creature dwelled. Chaos erupted. Alarms screamed. The creature, which researchers would come to call the Demogorgon, suddenly had access to cross between worlds. And 11, overwhelmed by what she had done, managed to escape in the confusion. This gate would remain open, though at this point no one fully understood what had been unleashed or how the dimensions were now connected. Freedom and Discovery, Season 1. When 11 fled Hawkins Laboratory, she was a child who had never felt rain, had never seen the stars, had never tasted food that wasn't served on a clinical tray. She was dressed only in a hospital gown, her head shaved, her understanding of the world limited to white rooms and ruthless experiments. But she possessed powers that defied comprehension, and those powers would guide her path in ways even she couldn't predict. Her first night of freedom was spent in a diner, where she stole food because she didn't understand the concept of paying for it. The owner, a kind man named Benny, took pity on her instead of calling the police. He gave her food, gave her clothes, tried to understand who she was and where she came from. For a brief moment, 11 experienced something she had never known. Simple human kindness, with no ulterior motive. But Brenner's agents tracked her there, and Benny paid for his compassion with his life. She fled into the woods, into the rain, alone and terrified in a world she didn't understand. That's where they found her. 3 boys on bicycles, searching through the forest for their missing friend Will Byers. Mike Wheeler, Lucas Sinclair, and Dustin Henderson were not prepared for what they discovered huddled in the woods. A soaking wet girl with a shaved head, wearing clothes sizes too large, who could barely speak in coherent sentences. Mike made the decision that would change everything. Against the better judgment of his friends, he brought her home, hid her in his basement, gave her safety and shelter. He didn't know about Hawkins Lab or the experiments. He just saw someone who needed help. And in return, 11 would demonstrate powers that shattered these boys' understanding of reality. Her abilities manifested in ways both subtle and dramatic during those early days of freedom. She could sense the Demogorgon's presence, could feel when it was near, even though it existed primarily in another dimension. She demonstrated her telekinesis casually, stopping Mike's van from rattling with just a thought. When the boys' bullies threatened them, forcing Mike to jump from a cliff into a quarry, 11 reached out with her mind and froze Mike in mid-air, levitating him gently back to safety before the bullies even understood what they were witnessing. The physical cost of her powers remained apparent. Every significant use caused her nose to bleed, sometimes profusely. After major exertions, she would become weak, needing rest and food to recover. The boys learned to stock up on Eggo waffles, which quickly became her favourite food, perhaps because they represented a simple pleasure she had never been allowed before. When government agents pursuing her caught up with the children, Forcing them into a desperate chase, 11 revealed the true scope of what she could do. A van full of agents blocked their path, cutting off their escape. 11, drawing on reserves of power fueled by her determination to protect her new friends, reached out with her mind and flipped the van through the air, sending it spinning over their heads to crash behind them. For the agents inside, the experience must have been terrifying beyond words. To be picked up by an invisible force and hurled like a toy. For 11, it meant exhaustion so complete that she could barely stand afterward. The boys eventually understood why 11 had fled the laboratory. She showed them, through halting words and fragmented explanations, that she had opened a gateway to another dimension, that the monster hunting Will existed because of her. She felt responsible. She felt the weight of what her actions, forced though they were, had unleashed upon the town. To find Will and the other missing girl, Barb Holland, Mike and the others constructed a makeshift sensory deprivation tank in the Hawkins Middle School gymnasium. They filled a kiddie pool with water and dumped in bags of de-icing salt, creating a crude approximation of the laboratory's sophisticated equipment. 11, trusting these children she'd only just met, climbed into the water, covered her eyes, and reached out with her mind. In the void, she found Barb first. The girl was dead, her body wrapped in vines in the other dimension, already beginning to be consumed by the ecosystem of rot and decay that characterized the Upside Down. The sight was so terrible that 11 screamed, had to be calmed by Joyce Byers, Will's desperate mother, who had believed against all reason that her son still lived. Then 11 found Will. He was alive, barely, hiding in a crude fort in a mirror image of his house in that nightmare dimension. Through 11, Joyce was able to communicate with her son, to tell him to hold on, that she was coming for him. It was a moment of hope in the midst of horror. Proof that 11's powers could be used for more than espionage and destruction. When confrontations became inevitable, when the agents closed in on the school, 11 showed another facet of her abilities. She didn't just throw objects or people. She could target specific organs, could reach inside bodies with her mind, and squeeze, crush, kill from within. Several agents died this way, their bodies dropping with crushed brains or stopped hearts, never knowing what hit them. It was brutal, terrifying, and effective. The girl who couldn't bring herself to harm a cat in a laboratory now killed without hesitation to protect the friends she had come to love. The final confrontation came in the school cafeteria. The Demogorgon, drawn by blood or some other instinct, broke through from its dimension into ours. It was a creature of nightmare, all teeth and petals of flesh, opening around a circular maw, standing taller than any human. Brenner's agents opened fire, but bullets seemed to mean little to something from another reality. 11 stepped forward. She knew what had to be done. She could feel it, could sense the connection between herself and this creature, between the gateway she had opened and the presence of this thing in the world. With Mike screaming at her not to sacrifice herself, with tears streaming down her blood-stained face, she reached out one final time. The amount of power she channeled was beyond anything she had attempted before. The Demogorgon began to disintegrate, its form breaking apart under the assault of her mind. But something else happened too. The barrier between dimensions weakened in the process, and 11 found herself being pulled through into the Upside Down along with the dissolving creature. Mike rushed forward, but found only empty air where 11 had stood. She was gone, seemingly sacrificed to destroy the monster that had come through the gate she'd opened. Evolution in Hiding. Season 2. The Upside Down was cold. Not the cold of winter or even of deep space, but something else entirely. The cold of a place where warmth and life had never truly existed. When 11 tumbled into this dimension, she found herself in a nightmare mirror of Hawkins Middle School. The building stood in the same place, shared the same basic architecture, but it was consumed by decay and threaded with vine-like growths that pulsed with an organic rhythm that suggested they might be alive. She wandered through this horrible place, calling out for Mike, for anyone, hearing only the echo of her own voice and the distant sounds of things moving in the darkness. How long she remained trapped there? Time had no meaning in a dimension where night never ended. But eventually, she found a tier in reality, a place where the membrane between worlds had grown thin enough for her to push through. She emerged, back in the school, back in Hawkins, alone and scared, but alive. The government was still searching for her. Brenner, if he had survived the Demogorgon attack, would never stop looking. So 11 did the only thing she could do. She went into hiding. She survived in the woods, on food stolen from gardens and garbage bins, sleeping rough, always moving, always afraid. She was miserable but free, until Jim Hopper found her. Hopper, the chief of police who had helped in the search for Will, had left Eggo waffles in a box in the woods, a signal and an offering. When 11 followed that trail back to its source, she found Hopper waiting, but he wasn't there to turn her in. Instead, he offered her something she desperately needed: shelter. Hopper's grandfather had owned a cabin deep in the woods, isolated and forgotten. Hopper brought 11 there, made it secure, stocked it with food and supplies. He taught her rudimentary reading using books and magazines. He brought her the first television she'd ever had access to outside of clinical settings, and she devoured shows like a person starved, learning about the world through its distorted reflection in entertainment. The cabin became 11's home, and the months she spent there proved crucial to her development. Without the laboratory's influence, without Brenner pushing her to weaponize every aspect of her consciousness, her powers began to evolve in new directions. Most significantly, she found she no longer needed the sensory deprivation tank to enter the void. At first, she could access it by blindfolding herself and listening to the static of a television tuned between channels. The white noise seemed to help her consciousness detach, to slip into that dark mental space where she could search for others. She used this ability almost nightly to check on Mike, to listen as he tried to reach her through his walkie-talkie, speaking into the void in the hope she might somehow hear. She heard every word, but had no way to respond, leading to a frustration that grew with each passing day. Her telekinesis was also evolving. Where before she had required intense emotional pressure to achieve significant feats, she now found she could move objects with greater ease. The nosebleeds still came, the exhaustion after major exertions remained, but her baseline capability had increased substantially. It was as if her powers were a muscle that had been exercised beyond its limits and was now growing stronger during the recovery period. But Hopper's protective nature eventually became a prison of a different kind. He forbade her from leaving the cabin, from making contact with Mike or her other friends. He meant well, understood the danger she would be in if discovered, but to 11 it felt like another form of captivity. When she saw Mike at school with a new girl, Max Mayfield, jealousy and loneliness drove her to act. She used her powers to knock Max off her skateboard, a petty act that brought her no satisfaction. The confrontation that followed drove 11 to run away again, this time in search of answers about her past. Using the document she had found hidden in Hopper's cabin, she located her mother, Terry Ives, living with her sister Becky. What she found broke her heart in new ways. Terry sat in a chair, unresponsive, trapped in her own mind by the electroshock therapy Brenner had used to silence her. She could only repeat a handful of words over and over, Breathe, sunflower, rainbow, 450, 3 to the right, 4 to the left. Using her powers in a way she never had before, 11 reached into her mother's shattered consciousness. She found memories there, fragmented and jumbled, but real. She saw her own birth, saw Terry's memories of the day in 1974 when her mother attempted a daring rescue. Armed with a gun, Terry had broken into the laboratory, made her way through security, and found the Rainbow Room where young Jane played with another girl, Kaylee. For a brief moment, mother and daughter were in the same room again, but guards apprehended Terry before she could complete the rescue, saw the moment when Brenner ordered the treatment that destroyed Terry's mind. 450 volts of electricity sent through her brain repeatedly until she was left in a permanent catatonic state. And she saw something else. Another child in the Rainbow Room. Another girl with powers like her own. This discovery sent 11 on a new journey, tracking down the girl she'd seen in her mother's memories. She used her powers to search, to reach across hundreds of miles until she found her. Kali Prasad, also known as 8, living in Chicago with a gang of runaways and misfits. Kali could cast illusions, could make people see entire realities that didn't exist. When 11 arrived, Kali welcomed her with the joy of someone finding a long-lost family member. Kali's approach to powers differed dramatically from anything 11 had experienced. She believed that anger was the key, that rage could fuel abilities, to heights that other emotions couldn't reach. She taught 11 to focus on her worst memories, on the pain of her mother's condition, on the deaths of those she'd loved. When 11 embraced this approach, when she let fury drive her powers, she accomplished feats she hadn't known were possible. She moved a railway car weighing several tons, sent it sliding along its tracks through sheer mental force. But Kaylee's philosophy came with a price. She and her gang sought revenge on those who had worked at the laboratory, who had participated in or enabled Brenner's experiments. When they tracked down one such person, a man named Ray Carroll, who had been present when Terry was subjected to electroshock, Kaylee encouraged 11 to kill him. 11 began to comply, using her powers to choke the life from him, feeling his pulse slow and weaken beneath her mental grip. Then she saw a photograph. Carol had daughters, 2 young girls who would lose their father if 11 continued. In that moment, she understood something crucial. Power fueled by hate and rage might be strong, but it turned the wielder into something monstrous. She released Carol and prevented Kaylee from shooting him. Love and mercy could be sources of strength too, even if that strength manifested differently. Through the void, 11 sensed that Hopper and Mike were in danger back in Hawkins. The moment of decision came clearly. She could stay with Kaylee, could continue exploring the dark side of her abilities, or she could return home to protect those she cared about. The choice ultimately wasn't difficult at all. She left Chicago and headed back to Hawkins, arriving just in time for the battle that would define this chapter of her life. The Mind Flayer, an entity of vast and alien intelligence that controlled the Upside Down, had extended its influence into Hawkins through a network of tunnels and through possessed individuals. A gate between dimensions still remained open, deep beneath the laboratory, and it was growing larger. Hopper and 11 descended into those depths to seal it. What happened in that moment revealed just how far 11's powers had evolved. Standing before the gate, looking into the shifting chaos of the Upside Down beyond, she reached out not to destroy, but to close, to heal the tear in reality. The strain was immense. Blood poured from her nose, from her eyes. Her body lifted off the ground, as if the sheer force of power channeling through her was too much for gravity to hold down. But inch by inch, with Joy Spires maintaining a rope anchoring 11's physical form, the gate sealed itself. The experience left 11 completely drained, unable to walk without support, barely conscious. But she had succeeded. The direct connection between dimensions was severed, and the Mind Flayer's influence in Hawkins was cut off. Later, Dr. Sam Owens, a government scientist more sympathetic than Brenner had ever been, met with Hopper and presented him with forged documents, adoption papers, a birth certificate identifying Jane Hopper as Hopper's daughter. 11 finally had a legal identity, a real name in the world beyond the laboratory. That night, Hopper allowed her to attend the school's snowball dance, the first truly normal social event of her life. She wore a dress that made her feel beautiful, had her hair styled in a way that seemed impossibly elegant, after years of a shaved head and rough cuts. When Mike saw her, his face lit up with joy and relief that she had survived, that she had returned. They danced together, and for just a moment, the girl who could tear open dimensions was simply a teenager at a school dance, happy and safe. But in the Upside Down, the Mind Flayer watched. It had not forgotten 11, had not forgiven her interference. It observed the snowball through the sealed gate, and it began to plan. Testing Limits. Season 3. The summer of 1985 brought new challenges and new relationships. 11 and Mike had been dating for months, much to Hopper's increasing frustration. He saw his adopted daughter growing up faster than he was comfortable with, spending time with a boy in ways that made him worry about things he didn't know how to address. His solution, ultimately, was to force Mike and 11 apart through stern conversations backed by implied threats, though this created more problems than it solved. But the forced distance had an unexpected benefit. 11 formed a genuine friendship with Max Mayfield, the girl she'd once knocked off her skateboard in a moment of jealousy. Max introduced her to shopping at the new Starcourt Mall, to fashion magazines and makeovers, to all the normal teenage girl experiences that 11 had been denied. For the first time in her life, she was learning to be something other than a weapon or a science experiment. She was learning to be herself. Her powers during this time remained formidable. She demonstrated precise control when helping her friends investigate strange behaviour from Max's stepbrother, Billy Hargrove. Using her abilities, 11 reached into Billy's mind, searching for the source of his erratic actions. What she found was the Mind Flayer, which had found a way back into their world despite the closed gate. It had possessed Billy and dozens of others, using them to build a proxy body in this dimension, a physical avatar made of melted flesh and bone. The battle that Summer tested 11 in ways even the previous year hadn't. The Mind Flayer wanted her specifically, wanted revenge for her interference, wanted to eliminate the one force capable of stopping its plans. When it attacked Hopper's cabin, 11 fought it directly, using her telekinesis to tear chunks from its amorphous body, to slow its advance long enough for her friends to flee. But the Mind Flayer adapted. It struck at 11 directly, one of its appendages biting deep into her leg. The wound itself was serious enough, but something far worse happened in that moment. The creature left something behind, a piece of itself embedded in her flesh, pulsing with malevolent life. The pain was excruciating, beyond anything she had experienced even during the worst of Brenner's experiments. As they desperately tried to find safety, to regroup and plan their next move, 11 found her powers failing. Simple telekinetic tasks that should have been effortless now resulted in nothing. The piece of the Mind Flayer in her leg seemed to be interfering with her abilities, blocking the neural pathways or energy flow or whatever mechanism allowed her to bend reality to her will. Panic began to set in Without her powers, how could she protect her friends? How could she stop what was coming? Jonathan attempted to cut the infected tissue from her leg, but the piece of the mind flayer had burrowed too deep, had fused itself to her in ways that made surgical removal impossible with their limited resources. The pain drove her to tears, but worse than the physical agony was the growing realization that she might lose her powers permanently. Finally, she did the only thing she could do. Drawing on reserves of willpower that had been built through years of torture and experimentation, 11 reached into her own body with her mind. She could feel the foreign presence, could sense it writhing within her. With a scream of effort and pain, she pulled it out through the wound, dragged it from her flesh through sheer mental force. The creature emerged, a mass of writhing tentacles and teeth, which Hopper immediately crushed beneath his boot. But the damage was done. In the aftermath of that desperate act of self-healing, 11's powers were simply gone. She tried to move objects, tried to enter the void, tried everything she knew, but nothing happened. No nosebleed? No sensation of energy flowing through her. Just emptiness where her abilities had been. The cost of saving herself had been the powers that defined her. The final battle at Starcourt Mall happened without 11's direct intervention. The Mind Flayer's proxy body, a massive creature of meat and malice, attacked with overwhelming force. 11 could only watch helplessly as her friends fought, as Billy, briefly breaking free of the Mind Flayer's control through 11's desperate appeal to his buried humanity, sacrificed himself to buy them time. She felt useless, broken, less than what she had been. When Hopper appeared to die, sealing the gate between dimensions, when the Mind Flayer's body collapsed into lifeless meat with its connection to the Upside Down severed, 11 felt the loss like a physical wound. She had lost her father figure. She had lost her powers. She had lost any sense of the person she thought she was becoming. Joyce Byers, recognizing that staying in Hawkins held too many painful memories and too much danger for 11, invited her to move to California with her family. 3 months after the battle, 11, now going by Jane in public, trying to blend in and be normal, left Hawkins behind. She and Mike promised to visit each other, to stay in contact, to make it work despite the distance. But as their car drove away from the only home she'd known since leaving the laboratory, she couldn't help but wonder if the girl with powers would ever return, or if that chapter of her life had closed forever. Powerless in Paradise, Season 4, Part 1. California should have been a fresh start. Sunshine and palm trees. A chance to be a normal teenager attending a normal high school. Free from the shadow of Hawkins and its nightmares. But reality proved far harsher than that idealistic dream. At Lenora Hills High School, 11, known to her classmates only as Jane Hopper, an awkward girl with a distant look in her eyes, quickly became a target for bullies. Angela, the ringleader, seemed to possess a sixth sense for identifying vulnerability. She saw this strange girl from Indiana with her outdated clothes and uncertain mannerisms, and she pounced. The bullying was relentless, cutting, designed to humiliate rather than to cause physical harm. For someone who had once been able to flip vehicles with her mind, the inability to defend herself was torture of a uniquely cruel kind. 11 tried. In the school courtyard, pushed beyond endurance, she reached out with her mind toward Angela, trying to summon even a flicker of her former abilities. Nothing happened. No surge of power. No nosebleed. Just Angela's mocking laughter and the stares of other students watching her stand there with her hand outstretched, like some deluded child pretending to have superpowers. The letters she sent to Mike painted a false picture of her new life. She described friends she didn't have, a social circle that didn't exist, a normal life that remained frustratingly out of reach. She couldn't bear to tell him the truth, that without her powers she felt incomplete, that she was struggling in ways that had nothing to do with interdimensional monsters and everything to do with simple human cruelty. When Mike flew out to visit during spring break, the facade became impossible to maintain. At a roller rink, a setting that should have been fun and harmless, Angela's bullying escalated. She humiliated Eleven in front of Mike and Will, made her the centre of a spectacle designed to crush what little confidence she had managed to salvage. Something inside Eleven snapped. She picked up a roller skate and struck Angela across the face with it, a purely physical act of violence born of rage and desperation. The attack left Angela with a broken nose and 11 in police custody. She hadn't used her powers, she couldn't, but the act revealed how lost she had become without them. The girl who had once killed trained agents with her mind had been reduced to common assault because that was all she was capable of anymore. Dr. Sam Owens arrived before the situation could spiral further out of control. He explained that a new threat had emerged in Hawkins, that people were dying in ways that suggested upside-down involvement, that Eleven's powers weren't just useful, they were essential. He claimed to have developed a program that could restore her abilities, make them even stronger than before. All she had to do was trust him and come to a secret facility. The decision should have been easy. People were dying. Her friends were in danger. But 11 had learned the hard way that trusting government scientists rarely ended well. Still, feeling powerless had been its own form of dying, a slow erosion of her sense of self. If there was even a chance of getting her abilities back, she had to take it. The facility was in Nevada, buried in the desert, isolated from everything. When 11 arrived, her worst fears were confirmed. Dr. Martin Brenner was alive and in charge of the project. The man she'd thought dead, the man who had tortured her childhood into something twisted and dark, stood before her with that same calculating gaze, speaking in that same quietly authoritative voice. He called the program Nina. It involved a sensory deprivation tank, but this one was different from those she'd known before. This one was wired into extensive computer systems, designed to play back recorded footage from the laboratory's security cameras. The goal was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. 11 would relive her past, would re-experience the moments when her powers had been at their peak, and through that process, her abilities would somehow reawaken. The first sessions were agonizing. 11 floated in the tank, while images and sounds from her childhood played through her consciousness. She saw herself as a small child, struggling with basic exercises. She saw 2 and the other children mocking her. She saw Brenner's cold approval when she finally killed those guards. Each memory was a wound reopening. But Brenner insisted this was necessary. He explained that her powers hadn't actually been destroyed by the Mind Flayer. Instead, the trauma of that attack had created something like a mental block, similar to what happens when stroke victims lose certain abilities. Her brain had, in essence, forgotten how to access the parts of itself that generated her powers. By reliving the memories of using those abilities, by retracing the neural pathways that had once been active, she could potentially rebuild those connections. The process was slow and frustrating. Sometimes she would feel a flicker of something, a momentary return of sensation that suggested her powers were still buried somewhere inside her. But these moments were fleeting, gone before she could grasp them, like trying to remember a dream after waking. Then the Nina project reached the memories from September 8th, 1979, when 11 was approximately 8 years old. She watched herself as that small child playing in the rainbow room with the other test subjects. She saw 2's escalating bullying, saw her own isolation and fear. And she saw the orderly, a kind-faced man who worked at the laboratory, who had always shown her small mercies and words of encouragement. The orderly's name, she learned, was Peter Ballard. He seemed different from the other adults at the laboratory, genuinely concerned for her well-being rather than just viewing her as an experimental subject. In the memories that played through the Nina tank, Peter taught her things that Brenna never had. He explained that powers came not just from anger or fear, but from any strong emotion. He showed her how to find the moments in her past that made her feel deeply, how to use those emotional anchors to focus and amplify her abilities. More crucially, Peter revealed something that changed everything. He, too, had been a test subject. He wore a device in his neck called Soteria, designed by Brenna to suppress psychic abilities. He claimed Brenna had implanted it in him years ago, turning him from a person with powers into a controllable asset. He appealed to Eleven's growing sense of rebellion, her desire to escape not just the current facility, but everything it represented. All she had to do was use her recovering powers to remove the Soteria from his neck. 11, desperate for an ally. Desperate to believe someone cared about her as a person rather than as a weapon, agreed. Using telekinesis that felt rusty and weak but functional, she removed the small device from Peter's neck. She felt proud of herself, felt like she was finally taking control of her own fate. Then Peter smiled, and everything went wrong. The moment his powers returned, Peter's friendly demeanour evaporated like morning fog. He revealed his true identity. He was subject number 1, the very first of Brenna's subjects, the template from which all the others had been derived. More than that, he was Henry Creel, the boy whose natural psychic abilities had inspired Brenna's entire program decades earlier. Henry had been wearing a mask for years, playing the role of the friendly orderly, waiting for an opportunity to escape his imprisonment. Now, with his powers fully restored, he no longer had any reason to pretend. He moved through the laboratory like a force of nature, killing with casual efficiency. Test subjects and researchers alike died as he crushed their bones and organs with his mind, painting the white walls red. 11 watched in mounting horror as Peter, Henry 1, slaughtered everyone she'd known. 2, who had mocked her, but was still just a child, died screaming. The younger subjects who had looked up to her, who she'd felt protective towards, were broken like dolls. Brenna survived only because Henry found him less interesting than killing everyone else first. When Henry turned his attention to 11, he spoke of a grand vision. He saw humanity as a disease, saw structure and civilization as prisons that choked out true nature. He had killed his own mother and sister years ago, had spent decades under Brenna's control, and now he wanted to reshape the world into something that reflected his twisted ideology. He wanted 11 to join him, to use their combined powers to tear down everything and let chaos reign. 11, still just a child despite everything she'd endured, refused. The battle between them shook the laboratory. Henry was older, more experienced, had been honing his abilities for decades. He should have won easily. For long stretches of their psychic duel, it seemed he would. He lifted 11 off the ground, began crushing her the same way he'd killed the others, spoke to her about how disappointing it was that she couldn't see the truth of his vision. But in that moment of desperation, 11 found something Henry never had, a pure memory of love. She remembered being born, remembered the brief moment before Brenna took her away, when her mother Terry had looked at her with complete, uncomplicated love. That memory, that feeling of being wanted and cherished, became a wellspring of power that anger could never match. 11's scream echoed through dimensions. The force she unleashed didn't just throw Henry back, It tore open reality itself. A portal appeared in the wall of the Rainbow Room, opening onto a dimension of swirling energy and lightning. A hellscape environment unlike anything in the known world. Henry Creel, number 1, was pulled through that opening, his body already beginning to be struck by lightning and otherworldly forces from the dimension he'd been thrust into. The portal sealed behind him, and he was gone. The strain of what she'd done caused 11 to collapse. When she woke days later in a hospital bed within the lab, Brenner told her everyone else was dead, told her she was the only survivor. But he didn't tell her the truth about what had happened, didn't reveal that she had been manipulated, that Henry had been the real killer. Instead, he implied she might have been responsible for the massacre, planted seeds of doubt that would poison her memories for years. Most importantly, Brenner didn't tell her what she'd done to Henry. She had no idea that the dimension she'd opened would transform him, that lightning and strange energies would burn and mutate his body over time. She didn't know that Henry Creel would survive in that hostile environment, would eventually find his way to or help create the upside-down dimension that would threaten everyone she cared about, would become the entity known as Vecna. 11, believing she might be a monster based on the false memories Brenner had allowed her to form, allowed those traumatic events to be suppressed. Her mind locked them away, buried them so deep that she would spend years not remembering, not knowing that Henry Creel was the true source of the Upside Down's evil, and that she had actually tried to stop him. Revelation and Restoration, Season 4, Part 2. Floating in the Nina tank, reliving those suppressed memories, 11 finally understood. She wasn't the monster. She had been manipulated by one, had been forced to enable his freedom. But the massacre had been Henry's doing, not hers. The relief of that realization was overwhelming, a weight lifting from her soul that she hadn't even fully known she'd been carrying. But more than that, remembering seemed to unlock something inside her. The neural pathways Brenner had spoken of, the connections that trauma had severed, began to reconnect. She felt it like electricity flowing through circuits that had gone dark, like a limb waking up from being asleep. Power surged through her again, stronger than it had been even before she lost it. When Brenner's assistant opened the tank to check on her, 11's eyes snapped open. She reached out with her mind, barely even trying, and sent him flying across the room. The nosebleed came, but it felt right somehow. Felt like a sign that she was whole again. She didn't want to stay in the facility another moment, didn't want to continue working with Brenner after everything she now remembered he'd put her through. But Brenner wasn't done with her. He activated lockdown protocols, had guards surround the tank chamber, tried to keep her contained while he ran more tests. He wanted to study her restored abilities, to measure and catalogue and push her further. Even after everything, he saw her as a resource to be exploited rather than as a person with rights and autonomy. 11, no longer the scared child who had once depended on Papa for everything, fought back. She threw guards aside with her mind, crushed equipment, made her way toward the exit with single-minded determination. The facility erupted into chaos around her. Alarms screamed, automated defenses activated. None of it mattered. She was more powerful than she'd ever been, and nothing was going to stop her from leaving. Outside the facility, an even greater danger emerged. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Sullivan, a military commander who believed 11 was responsible for the deaths in Hawkins, had arrived with a helicopter gunship. Sullivan was convinced that 11 herself was the threat, that her powers were the source of all the town's problems. He'd come to kill her before she could do more harm. The helicopter opened fire. Bullets tore through the desert sand, through the facility's outer structures. Brenner, in a moment of surprising selflessness, threw himself between 11 and the gunfire taking rounds that had been meant for her. As he lay dying, he tried one last time to tell her he'd cared for her, that everything he'd done had been because he saw her as special. She couldn't bring herself to forgive him, couldn't call him Papa one final time, but she didn't hate him either. She just walked away from his body, her face set with grim determination. The helicopter circled for another attack run. 11, standing alone in the desert with Brenner's blood on her clothes, looked up at it. She raised one hand, almost casually, and reached out with her mind. The helicopter was a massive piece of machinery, tons of metal and fuel and spinning rotors, but to 11's restored powers, it might as well have been a toy. She pulled it from the sky, like someone swatting a fly, sent it spinning and crashing into the desert floor. Mike, Will, Jonathan, and their friend Argyle arrived moments later, having fought their way past military roadblocks to reach her. They'd come to save her, but she didn't need saving anymore. She was more powerful than she'd ever been, but power alone wasn't enough. Back in Hawkins, her friends were facing Vecna, Henry Creel, transformed by years in the Upside Down into something barely human. And Max Mayfield, one of her closest friends, was directly in his crosshairs. They devised a desperate plan. 11 didn't need to physically return to Hawkins to help. Using a makeshift sensory deprivation tank assembled in the kitchen of a Surfer Boy pizza in Nevada, a kiddie pool, bags of salt, and some specialised equipment they'd cobbled together, she could project her consciousness across the distance and fight Vecna psychically while he attacked Max. This was a new application of her abilities, something beyond simple remote viewing. She called it piggybacking, entering into Max's consciousness and using her friend's mind as a conduit to confront Vecna directly. It required perfect timing, complete focus, and more power than she'd ever channeled at once. But she had to try. Submerged in the makeshift tank, blindfolded and focused, 11 reached out across half a continent. She found Max in the void, found her consciousness being slowly consumed by Vecna's attack. The entity that Henry Creel had become was something out of nightmares, part organic and part living vine, covered in scars and burns from his time in the Upside Down. He held Max suspended in his mindscape, breaking her bones one by one, preparing to finish what he'd started. 11 intervened, her own consciousness crashing into Vecna's like a freight train. The psychic battle that followed was unlike anything she'd experienced before. They fought across mental landscapes that shifted and changed, through memories and fears made manifest, each trying to overpower the other. Vecna was surprised by her strength, hadn't expected her to have regained her abilities, let alone grown stronger. But he was strong too. He'd had years in the Upside Down to develop his powers, to become something more than human. When Mike's voice reached 11 through the real world, telling her he loved her, reminding her of all the times she'd been there for him and he for her, it gave her the burst of strength she needed. Love, not anger. Connection, not rage. These were the sources of true power. 11 struck at Vecna with everything she had, drove him back, forced him to release Max, but the damage was done. Max's body back in Hawkins had been broken. Her heart had stopped. In that moment, 11 did something she'd never attempted before. She reached into Max's dying form and restarted her heart, used her powers to manipulate the organ itself, compressing and releasing it to force blood to flow again. Max's heart began beating. Her body began breathing, but her mind didn't return. Max remained in a coma, her consciousness somewhere 11 couldn't reach, trapped perhaps in some space between life and death. 11 had saved her friend's biological life, but couldn't bring her mind fully back. It was a victory and a failure combined, proof of her growing abilities but also a reminder of their limits. She could restart a heart, could manipulate biological systems, but consciousness itself remained beyond even her considerable reach. Meanwhile, in Hawkins, Steve, Nancy and Robin had mounted a physical assault on Vecna's actual body in the Upside Down. Using Molotov cocktails and shotguns, they'd set him ablaze, blown holes in him, left him a charred and broken thing. But even that hadn't killed him. Vecna had escaped, fled deeper into his domain, wounded but alive and more determined than ever. The battle, for all the power 11 had brought to bear, ended in a stalemate at best. Vecna's plan had succeeded partially. Max's brief death had opened a fourth gate to the Upside Down. The town of Hawkins began to tear itself apart as that dimension bled into theirs, creating massive fissures that split neighbourhoods and swallowed buildings. Ash began to fall from the sky, and strange particles floated in the air, visible only as shadows in certain lights. When 11 finally returned to Hawkins in person, 2 days after the battle, she found a town transformed. Refugees filled the high school gymnasium, families displaced by the spreading disaster. The government had responded with emergency services and military presence, but no one understood what was really happening or how to stop it. Hopper, miraculously alive, rescued from a Russian prison by Joyce, reunited with 11 in an embrace that brought tears to both their eyes. But there was no time to celebrate. 11 could feel Vecna out there, recovering from his wounds, planning his next move. The final confrontation was coming, and despite all her power, despite everything she'd learned and overcome, she wasn't sure she could win. The arsenal revealed. Catalogue of abilities. To understand what 11 has become, to truly grasp the scope of her capabilities, we need to examine each of her powers individually. She's not just a psychic or a telekinetic. She's something unprecedented. A human consciousness pushed beyond the normal boundaries of what minds can accomplish. Her most fundamental ability remains telekinesis, the power to move objects with her mind. At its simplest, this manifests as small manipulations. She can turn off lights, can cause small objects to drift, through the air, can apply pressure to things at a distance. These minor applications require minimal effort and cause little strain. But 11's telekinesis scales dramatically. She has flipped vehicles weighing multiple tons, has moved train cars, has torn pieces from the Mind Flayer's proxy body, has pulled a military helicopter from the sky. When she focuses her full power on a single target, the forces she can generate are enormous, limited seemingly only by her mental endurance and the physical consequences of channeling such energy. Her telekinesis isn't limited to pushing and pulling. She has demonstrated the ability to grip objects with invisible force, to twist and break them, to compress them until they crumble or explode. The soda can crushed in her first laboratory test was just the beginning. She's since demonstrated the ability to target specific components of complex objects, like disabling weapons or crushing mechanical systems. The void represents her most unique ability, a form of consciousness projection that goes beyond ordinary remote viewing. When 11 enters the void, either through sensory deprivation or simply through concentration if her powers are strong enough, she experiences herself standing in an endless darkness. It's not a physical place, but rather a mental space, a representation of the psychic realm her mind inhabits when freed from normal sensory input. In the void, she can search for people. The process seems to work through some combination of focused intent and emotional connection. If she knows someone well, or has a photograph or belonging of theirs, she can locate them regardless of distance. Once found, they appear in the void as if standing in a spotlight, visible to 11 even though they can't initially see her. She can observe these people, can watch their actions and hear their words in real time. This made her valuable to Brenner for espionage purposes. She could find Soviet agents halfway around the world and report on what they were doing. But for 11, the Void became more than a spying tool. It became her way of checking on Mike during their year apart, of finding her mother when she learned her identity, of locating Kaylee in Chicago. The Void also allows for limited interaction. Sometimes the people she's observing can sense her presence, especially if they have some psychic sensitivity themselves, or if she makes her presence known deliberately. She can project her voice into their awareness, though this requires significant effort. When she communicated with Will in the Upside Down, telling him to hold on, it required her to be in a full sensory deprivation tank setup to maintain that connection. More recently, 11 has developed the ability to not just observe in the void, but to actually enter into someone else's consciousness, to see through their eyes and experience their thoughts. She did this with Max when battling Vecna, using piggybacking to project herself into her friend's mind. This represents an evolution of her void abilities into something approaching true telepathy. Her memory manipulation powers emerged gradually. She discovered she could access the memories of others, particularly when those people were unable to communicate normally. With her mother Terry trapped in a catatonic state, 11 entered her mind and relived Terry's memories as if they were her own. She saw her birth from her mother's perspective, saw the electroshock therapy, saw the desperate attempt at rescue. She later used this ability on Billy Hargrove when he was possessed by the Mind Flayer. She reached into his consciousness, past the entity controlling him, and accessed his memories of childhood. She showed him these memories, reminded him of who he'd been before trauma and abuse twisted him into something darker. This act of memory manipulation was what broke the Mind Flayer's control long enough for Billy to sacrifice himself. The ability to create and close portals to the Upside Down is perhaps 11's most consequential power, and the one she understands least. She opened the first gate in 1983 when she touched the Demogorgon in the void during her laboratory experiment. She wasn't trying to create a dimensional rift. It simply happened as a byproduct of the contact between her consciousness and an entity from another reality. She opened a second portal when she banished Henry Creel to the Upside Down. This one was more directed, though still not fully controlled. It appeared as a tear in the wall of the Rainbow Room, revealing glimpses of the dark dimension beyond, before sealing itself after Henry fell through. Closing portals proved to be within her abilities as well. At the end of her second year of freedom, she sealed the gate beneath Hawkins Laboratory, mending the tear in reality through an application of power that left her physically levitating and bleeding from multiple orifices. The strain nearly killed her, but the gate closed and stayed closed until Vecna forced it open again years later. What's less clear is the nature of what 11 created when she banished Henry. The dimension he was sent to appears to have been distinct from what we now know as the Upside Down, a hellscape environment where lightning and otherworldly forces transformed him over time. The Upside Down that mirrors Hawkins, frozen in the state it was in on November 6th, 1983, seems to have been created, or at least shaped, when 11 opened the gate during that first experiment with the Demogorgon. Whether Vecna later used his powers to mould this dimension into the reflection of Hawkins we see, or whether the gate itself created that mirroring effect, remains one of the unexplained mysteries of these events. Her biokinesis, the ability to affect living tissue and biological processes, is perhaps her most ethically complex power. She can kill with terrifying efficiency by targeting internal organs. She's crushed brains, stopped hearts, broken bones without ever touching her victims. Guards at the laboratory, government agents, anyone who threatened her or her friends could be eliminated in seconds through applications of force to their body's vulnerable parts. But biokinesis isn't just for destruction. When Max's heart stopped, 11 reached into her friend's chest cavity, not physically but psychically, and manipulated the organ itself. She compressed it, released it, compressed again, manually performing cardiac massage from across the country through sheer force of mental will. The heart resumed beating. Blood began flowing again. In that moment, 11 performed the closest thing to resurrection that human capabilities can achieve. She's also demonstrated the ability to affect her own body. When the piece of the mind flayer was embedded in her leg, she extracted it through internal manipulation, pulling foreign tissue through her flesh using nothing but mental force. The pain must have been extraordinary, but it proved she could turn her powers inward, could affect her own biological systems the same way she affected others. Technology responds to her powers in unusual ways. Electronic devices flicker and fail when she uses her abilities nearby. Lights dim or shatter. Television sets display static. Radio frequencies become corrupted. This electromagnetic disruption seems to be an unintentional side effect rather than a directed ability. Her powers generate some kind of field that interferes with electrical systems. She's learned to use this to her advantage, though. She can turn lights on and off at will, can cause specific equipment to malfunction, can manipulate electrical systems with increasing precision. The fact that she communicates through television static when operating in the void suggests she's actually creating electromagnetic phenomena, broadcasting her consciousness on frequencies that electronic devices can detect even if human senses cannot. Her levitation is more symptom than power. It occurs involuntarily when she channels enormous amounts of energy. During the closing of the gate in Season 2, her body lifted from the ground, suspended by forces flowing through her. It wasn't something she chose to do. It simply happened as a consequence of the sheer magnitude of power she was wielding. But recent developments suggest she's learning to control this effect. The Season 5 preview footage showed her making a running leap onto a bus with a height and distance that defies normal human capability. This suggests she's beginning to consciously use the same forces that cause involuntary levitation to enhance her physical movements, to essentially fly, or at least to jump, with superhuman ability. The price of power. Every application of 11's abilities comes at a cost. The most visible is the nosebleed, blood streaming from her nostrils whenever she exerts significant force. This isn't just a minor inconvenience, it's a sign of the physical strain her brain undergoes when channeling power. The blood comes from ruptured capillaries in her nasal cavity, vessels bursting under the pressure of increased blood flow and neurological activity. For particularly intense exertions, the bleeding extends beyond her nose. Her eyes weep blood. Her ears leak crimson fluid. These symptoms indicate that her entire cranial vascular system is being stressed beyond normal limits. In a medical context, such symptoms would suggest immediate risk of stroke or brain hemorrhage. The exhaustion that follows major uses of her powers is equally debilitating. After flipping the van in Season 1, she could barely stand. After closing the gate in Season 2, she needed to be carried out of the laboratory. After pulling down the helicopter in Season 4, she slumped to the ground, temporarily spent. It's as if her powers draw from her body's energy reserves like a battery being drained, and she needs time to recharge. This physical toll has decreased as she's grown older and more experienced with her abilities. Her baseline capabilities have increased, meaning actions that once left her exhausted now cause only moderate strain. She's learned to pace herself, to judge how much power a given task will require, to avoid completely depleting herself except in the most desperate circumstances. But there are psychological costs too, perhaps even greater than the physical ones. For years, 11 believed that her powers required anger and trauma as fuel. Brenner encouraged this belief, designed situations that would provoke extreme emotions because he observed that she performed better when in heightened emotional states. This conditioning created a complex relationship with her abilities. They were tied to her worst memories, to her deepest pain. Kaylee reinforced this message when she taught 11 to focus on rage, to remember the people who had hurt her, to channel hatred into power. For a time, this approach worked. 11 accomplished feats she'd struggled with before by embracing the dark emotions that Carly insisted were the key to their abilities. But the confrontation with Vecna revealed a fundamental truth that neither Brenner nor Carly had understood. Love is a more powerful motivator than anger. When 11 was losing her battle against Henry Creel, when his powers threatened to crush her, it wasn't rage that saved her. It was the memory of her mother's love, the feeling of being wanted and cherished, the knowledge that people cared about her, not for what she could do, but for who she was. Similarly, when she needed to overpower Vecna in Season 4, Mike's declaration of love gave her the strength to prevail. Not hatred, not fury. Just the simple, profound power of being loved and loving in return. This realization has slowly shifted how 11 approaches her abilities, moving away from trauma as fuel toward connection and positive emotion. Yet this emotional dependence creates its own vulnerability. Her powers fluctuate based on her mental state. When she's confident and emotionally centered, they flow easily. When she's uncertain, afraid, or disconnected from her sense of self, they falter. The loss of her abilities after the Mind Flayer's attack wasn't just physical trauma, it was psychological. A complete collapse of her identity as a person with powers. Recovering required her to remember who she was, to reconnect with the core of her being that made those powers possible. The isolation that comes with being different is perhaps the subtlest cost. 11 has never been normal, has never had the option of blending into a crowd and living an unremarkable life. Her powers make her a target, make her valuable to those who want to exploit her, and dangerous to those who fear her. The laboratory wanted to use her as a weapon. The government saw her as a threat. Even among friends, she was often defined by what she could do rather than who she was. Her relationship with Mike represents, in many ways, her attempt to be seen as a person first and a psychic second. He was the first one to treat her as more than her abilities, to care about her well-being, not because of what she could accomplish, but simply because she mattered to him. This is why his opinions and feelings affect her so profoundly. He represents the normal life she desperately wants but can never fully have. The moral weight of her actions haunts her too. She's killed dozens of people, perhaps more. Some were agents trying to capture her, operating under orders from a government that saw her as a dangerous asset to contain. Some were guards at the laboratory, just doing their jobs. She tells herself they were complicit in Brenner's experiments, that they enabled her abuse, but does that justify ending their lives? The ease with which she can kill is itself troubling. It requires only a thought, a moment of focus. No physical struggle, no blood on her hands in the literal sense. She can stop a heart or crush a brain while standing across a room, never having to confront the reality of what she's doing in a visceral way. This distance from the act of killing could, in theory, make it psychologically easier to take lives. But for 11, who feels so deeply, who forms attachment so readily, each death leaves a mark on her conscience. The road ahead. As the story moves toward its conclusion, 11 stands at a crossroads. Her powers have never been stronger. She can accomplish feats now that would have been impossible just a year ago. She's learning new applications of her abilities, pushing boundaries that even she didn't know existed. The Season 5 preview, suggesting she might develop true flight, represents just one possibility among many. But power alone won't be enough to defeat Vecna. Henry Creel has had years in the Upside Down to hone his abilities, to merge with that dimension in ways that make him something more than human. He's not just psychically powerful, he's become part of the very fabric of that reality, able to manipulate it in ways 11 is only beginning to understand. He can create gates, can possess people, can reach into the minds of his victims and show them their worst fears. The final battle will be as much about will and determination as about raw power. 11 has the advantage of connection. She fights for her friends, for Hopper, for Max, for Mike. She fights to protect the normal life she's glimpsed, but never quite achieved. Henry fights only for destruction, for a nihilistic vision of a world reshaped according to his twisted desires. This fundamental difference in motivation may prove decisive. There's also the question of what happens to 11 after. Assuming she survives, assuming Vecna is defeated, and the Upside Down is sealed away permanently, what becomes of a young woman whose entire identity has been built around having impossible abilities? Can she ever truly be normal? Does she want to be? Max remains in a coma, her mind lost somewhere between life and death. 11 has promised to bring her back, has vowed that she won't rest until her friend is whole again. But can her powers truly raise someone from that state? Can biokinesis extend to restoring consciousness, to rebuilding a damaged mind? These questions will demand answers, and 11 will push herself to find them regardless of the cost. The other children from the laboratory, the ones who didn't survive Henry's massacre, deserve justice too. Their deaths weren't 11's fault, but she carries them with her nonetheless. In a sense, she's the only one left who remembers them, who knows they existed and what they suffered. Their memory deserves more than to be buried in classified files and forgotten. And then there's the question of her mother. Terry Ives remains trapped in her broken mind, endlessly reliving fragments of trauma. 11's growing abilities with consciousness manipulation might offer hope. If she can enter her mother's mind more fully, if she can repair whatever damage the electroshock therapy caused, perhaps she could give Terry back herself. It's a long shot, perhaps impossible, but it's a dream that 11 holds on to. The government's response to her existence remains a threat. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan represented one faction that saw her as a danger, to be eliminated. Others, like Dr. Owens, see her as a potential asset to be protected and deployed. Still others probably view her as a subject for further study, would love nothing more than to understand how her abilities work, so they can be replicated in others. 11's freedom will always be conditional, so long as she has powers that governments covet. But perhaps that's the final lesson she needs to learn. She spent so much of her life defined by her abilities, by what she can do rather than who she is. The loss of her powers after the Mind Flayer attack devastated her precisely because she had built her entire sense of self around being special, being useful, being the one who could save everyone. When those abilities vanished, she felt like she had no value, no purpose. The truth she's slowly discovering is that her worth never came from her telekinesis or her remote viewing or any other power. It came from her compassion, her loyalty, her capacity for love despite everything she'd endured. Mike didn't fall for her because she could flip vans with her mind. Hopper didn't adopt her because she was useful in fights. Max didn't become her friend because of her abilities. They cared about Jane Hopper, the person, not Eleven the psychic. As the final confrontation approaches, as ash falls from the sky over Hawkins and the Upside Down continues its slow invasion of reality, Eleven must embrace both sides of herself. She needs to be the powerful psychic who can stand against Vecna in a battle of wills and reality-bending force. But she also needs to be the teenage girl who loves her friends, who wants nothing more than to go to movies and eat waffles and do homework and complain about everyday problems. The story that began in a laboratory with a child stripped of her name and her humanity will end with that same person fully embracing both what makes her different and what makes her human. The powers matter, yes, they'll be crucial in the battles to come, but they're just one part of who she is, one aspect of a person who has grown from a frightened subject into someone who chooses her own path, who decides for herself what her abilities will be used for. Whatever happens in the final chapter, whatever new abilities she develops, or what costs she pays for using them, Eleven, Jane, will face it on her own terms. Not as Brenner's weapon, not as anyone's tool or subject or asset, just as herself. And that might be the most powerful thing about her after all. The journey continues. This has been the complete timeline of Eleven's powers and abilities, from her origins in a government experiment through her transformation into something unprecedented in human experience. We've explored every documented use of her abilities, every evolution and expansion of what she can accomplish, every cost she's paid for wielding forces that shouldn't exist. But in many ways, her story is just beginning. The powers that define her continue to grow, continue to surprise even those who think they understand what she's capable of. With each challenge she faces, with each person she protects, and each connection she forms, she discovers new applications, new possibilities, new ways that human consciousness can reach beyond its supposed limits. The girl who escaped from a laboratory with barely the ability to speak has become a person who can restart hearts, who can close tears in reality, who can face down entities of impossible power and emerge victorious. She's learned that strength comes not from anger or fear, but from love and connection. She's discovered that being human isn't about being normal. It's about choosing compassion, about fighting for those who matter to you, about refusing to let trauma define who you become. Her journey has been marked by blood and tears, by loss and sacrifice, by moments of terror and despair. But it's also been marked by friendship, by found family, by the simple joy of eating waffles with people who care about you, by the comfort of knowing you're not alone in the darkness. These moments of light make the darkness bearable, make the fight worthwhile, make the power she possesses into tools for protection rather than weapons of destruction. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the extraordinary story of this remarkable person. Think about what it means to be different, to have abilities that set you apart, to struggle with the weight of being special. Think about how love can be the most powerful force in the universe, how choosing compassion over rage can change not just yourself, but the world around you. Think about the girl who was named with a number, but became a person, who was meant to be a weapon, but chose to be a hero. And if you've enjoyed this journey through Eleven's complete power timeline, if these stories have resonated with you or helped you drift into peaceful sleep, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button to let me know this kind of deep dive interests you. There are so many more stories to explore, so many more characters whose journeys deserve this kind of attention, so many more worlds to examine as you prepare for sleep. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of fiction's most fascinating characters. Until next time, sleep well and dream of the impossible made real.